everyone. Welcome to the May 14th edition of the TimeformUS Pacecast. This week on the podcast, we're going to look back at the Man of War Racing Festival from last weekend at Belmont Park. There was something for everyone on Saturday at Belmont. There were turf races, a nice race for 3-year-olds, some sprint action, and we'll talk about all of that. We'll also touch upon a few races from other parts of the country, some tracks that we don't often visit on this podcast. And at the end of the podcast, well, if we have some time, we'll talk about some of the Preakness Contenders, the potential pace of that race, and just go through our thoughts coming out of the Kentucky Derby, moving on to the second jewel of the Triple Crown. I can't believe the Preakness is going to be here already. It just seems like we finished talking about the Derby a few days ago, wearing actually a Preakness t-shirt today to try to get myself in the mood for the race. I'm David Aragona, of course, and I'll welcome my co-host, Craig Milkowski. Craig, how are you doing? And ready to talk about some Belmont and Preakness today?
I am. It was kind of nice to get back to a more normal week of racing with, just a little lighter stake schedule, not the hectic Derby week. And, looking forward to the Preakness next week.
Yeah, we'll start with Belmont. And I think there's a lot to go through, mostly from Saturday's card. We'll start with the two turf races that occurred at Belmont Park on Saturday. The Man of War was the feature, obviously. That was the lone Grade 1 race on the card. There was also the Bogey earlier on. The Man of War and the Bogey, including another race earlier on the card, featured really different pace situations. And I would imagine this made a really difficult situation for speed figure makers trying to get a handle on how to assess these races. We'll start with the Man of War, where Channel Maker won, got a 1:24 TimeformUS speed figure. I thought he ran really well. I thought he got back to one of his better races. Was this the toughest Grade 1 field that we're going to see this year? Probably not. But I thought just given the way the race unfolded, he put in a pretty nice effort, though obviously Hunting Horn, who went out to the early lead, really created an interesting situation that made this race so much different from the other races on the card.
Yeah, he did. It's a speed figure guy. I love it because, he was in as a rabbit for Magic Wand. He had a jockey that hardly anybody'd ever heard of, and he just kind of ran off. But the one good thing as a speed figure guy is when you get an honest to, in this case, a very fast pace, the speed figure is usually going to be pretty easy to make. Generally, races at this distance, I kind of separate from the other ones anyway. So I did this race in isolation. That's where the 124 came from. Arklow got a 123, running a good second. But I think, as you say, he kind of points out Arklow running second. Solid horse. I don't think he's really a Grade 1 horse. But, good effort. And Channel Maker certainly rebounded. His last few running lines hadn't been very pretty. So good effort from him. Good to see him back in form. And probably not a Grade 1 speed figure, but, around Grade 2, which I think is what this field really was.
Yeah, my initial reaction to looking at the speed figures that you posted was, oh, well, that's a little weird that the Man of War got a lower speed figure than the Grade 3 race that we're going to talk about next. But I kind of agree with you. I don't think Channel Maker put forth his best effort to win this Man of War. I thought he just got the job done because he was in the right spot at the top of the stretch. He sort of got the jump on a horse like Arklow, who it's hard for jockeys to time moves when a race is run in the fashion that the Man of War was run, where Michael Hussey, the jockey on Hunting Horn, really had a mission to just create as much separation as possible moving down the backstretch. It's kind of very similar to the tactics that we saw Aidan O'Brien employ with Highland Reel in the Breeders' Cup Turf from a few years ago, where he tries to use a horse's stamina to really build up an advantage and then get that horse to hold on late. I do think Hunting Horn was in the race as a rabbit, as the American audiences would understand it. But Hunting Horn is a good horse in his own right. So he's a rabbit who sort of did have a chance to win the race. I don't think he was in the race to lose. It's not as if he had to be a couple interest with Magic Wand because he had no chance to win the race. They just rode him in a very different fashion to give both horses their best chance. Hunting Horn, he just had a huge advantage coming to the top of the stretch, and Channel Maker got the jump on the rest of the horses. Arklow, he got a favorable pace set up, but he just had a little bit too much ground to make up late. He was moving faster to fall across the wire. I agree with you. Not the best race by any of these horses in terms of, the top performances we're going to see from other horses at Grade 1 company later in the year. But I thought they were solid enough efforts. Channel Maker didn't quite get back to the 130 or 131 TimeformUS speed figure that he earned in the Turf Classic last year when he beat Robert Bruce by about 4 lengths in that race. But this performance just didn't quite measure up to that. Moving on to the Bogey, I want to talk a little bit about this speed figure because this was one of the races that I think was really difficult to assess from a pace standpoint. It went slower than another mile in the 16th race on the card for maidens, but that was completely due to how slowly they went in the early going. And Homerique, the winner, was able to overcome that slow pace.
Yes, she was. And this is just a case where, you have to break the race out. There's no way you can rate it in line with the other turf races, or we'd have these horses looking like cheap claimers running on the turf. And it's just a case of where the pace completely dictated final time. But that said, I think it was a huge effort from Homerique. She had run well overseas, ran well in grade ones, group ones, I guess, as they call them over there. And the fact she was able to make up so much ground and win pretty easily. I mean, she only won by a half length, but I think the margin's a bit deceiving. And, it didn't fool anyone. She was 4-5 on the morning line, or 4-5 she went off at. So not a huge surprise, but it's definitely an interesting look at our speed figures. Despite only winning by a half a length, she has a full 7-point advantage over the other Chad Brown runner, Competition of Ideas, who got a 121, which is a solid enough figure in here. She was finishing really fast, too, but the way our figures work, it's how many horses do you pass, how fast are you finishing when the pace is slow. And that's where the figure came from Homerique. And I think it was deserved. I think it was a big effort, and she's probably right at the top of the division now.
Yeah, I totally agree that it is the right philosophy to reward horses for coming home really fast in turf races that feature slow paces. I think it really does point out a horse with exceptional ability that might have run a slow final time, but the way that they finish the race is the most important part. The question that I want to ask you, though, is when we set up this algorithm to reward horses for slow paces, were we envisioning a race like this, a race to this extreme? Because I see the final time figure for this race is a 116, and Homerique is getting a 12-point bump above that to get the 128 number. I mean, it seems like a lot for a horse that ran a final time that's so much slower. Is this as big of a bump as we've seen, or is there a cap on how much of a bonus a horse can get in this situation? Just talk a little bit about that and how much it really makes sense to reward these horses for coming home so fast in these races.
Yeah, there is a cap, and this is about it for a turf route. I've seen bigger ones in dirt sprints with really fast paces, in the other direction, where horses will get bumped up. But we actually did a study of our figures, and it turned out that this was definitely the way to go. The horses with the bigger bumps actually performed the best from an ROI perspective, and did just as well from a win percentage perspective. So pretty comfortable doing it this way. It was something that when we first began at TimeformUS, it was a question that came up repeatedly. And so we did the work and did the study and found out it was the way to go.
Yeah, it's something I don't have a problem with because I really do agree with the philosophy. I just realized how it might be confusing to some people to see a race that seemingly went so slowly getting a faster TimeformUS speed figure than the grade 1 Man of War for the males. But when you see it broken down this way, I think it does make sense. I just do want to briefly touch upon the trips of the two Chad Brown horses before we move on, because there's a difference between just looking at the pure numbers and how fast they came home and the closing splits, and then analyzing the trips of the two horses, because I do think Homerique got the better trip than Competition of Ideas. She was a little farther behind in the early going, but it wasn't significant. At most, she was maybe a length and a half behind Competition of Ideas moving down the backstretch and around the far turn. But I thought Homerique's rider, Irad Ortiz, did the right thing by getting her out into the clear as soon as he was able to at the top of the stretch. He was able to get that clear run through the lane, where Competition of Ideas pause while trying to find room at about the 3/16th pole. And when you're coming home this quickly and the race is basically turning into a quarter-mile sprint to the wire, you don't want to get your momentum broken at any point. And I just thought Competition of Ideas really lost the race at the 3/16th pole when she just didn't have that clear path inside, as opposed to Homerique, who was able to build up that momentum. Yeah,
that's a really good point. The one thing I wanted to say, when the pace is this slow, ground loss, in my opinion, it just doesn't matter. You're way better off being in the clear. I kind of picture it if I'm jogging around the track and I'm, if I'm walking in the outside lane, I can easily keep up with somebody walking in the inside lane without spending a whole lot of extra energy. So definitely being clear is the way to go. And I agree with you on the trip. There's no real way to reflect that in the number, but, I'm a guy who, like you, I try to combine the two, look at trips and how they may have affected the number and the horses coming out of the race.
Yeah, ground loss is a funny thing because, first of all, it doesn't matter as much at Belmont Park because the turns are just more gradual than other tracks, even on the turf courses. But also, I agree with you about ground loss occurring at certain points in the race. When they're just kind of galloping around the far turn, no one's really, running with any sort of intensity. I feel like ground loss doesn't matter quite as much. Whereas when you get into the straight and they're really sprinting to the wire, if they were going around a turn at that point, I think ground loss would matter quite a bit because the horses that are moving at their fastest speed towards the inside would be gaining a real advantage. I just don't think it matters that much on the turn when these horses are basically just, waltzing around there at a very leisurely pace.
Right. I'm the same way. And that's one of the ways I use our figures with the blue and red highlighting. I give much more credence to ground loss when the pace is hot and we see red fractions than I do when it's slow and in blue.
Earlier on the Belmont card on Saturday, we saw a race for the 3-year-olds that generated a lot of buzz. The Peter Pan, won by Global Campaign. Global Campaign is a horse that we had talked about quite a bit earlier in the year on the podcast. He had been very impressive in a couple of races down at Gulfstream, a maiden score and an allowance win. He disappointed to some in the Fountain of Youth, although I think we both thought he ran pretty well in that race because he was chasing the extremely fast pace set by Hidden Scroll. He hung on well to be fifth that day. Global Campaign in this Peter Pan, the pace was not fast. It was pretty moderate, but it was an honest pace at the very least. And he was just sitting in the right spot, stalking it, got the jump on the closers. And he was just much the best in this race. I don't think there's any other way to spin it. The final time was solid. And I think him, as well as the runner-up Sir Winston, are intriguing contenders moving on to the Belmont Stakes.
Yeah, I do. Global Campaign, he was actually my picking out of the gate this week. I thought he looked really strong and kind of had this field over a barrel. I didn't go exactly how it looked on the pace projector. Thought Global Campaign would probably make the early lead. But Final Jeopardy, not Final Jeopardy, the other horse whose name I'm forgetting.
Intrepid Heart?
No, the horse who went up to the lead. Federal Case, I believe it was.
That's right.
Yeah, Federal Case kind of showed some surprising early speed and took the lead from him. But Global Campaign showed that he was able to raid off of it. Finished well, opened up a lead when that one kind of backed out and got a nice 119 TimeformUS speed figure. That's comparative. We'll see in the Preakness next week, as we'll talk about a little bit later. But good effort from him. Obviously, that's too soon for him. I don't really think he's a Belmont horse. Maybe he's a horse that would be pointed to a race like the Haskell or maybe even the Jim Dandy. But I thought it was a good effort from him and the second horse, as you mentioned as well, Sir Winston, who had a bit of a trip last time out and ran back to the numbers he'd been running before that.
Yeah, people talked about Hunting Horn being the rabbit on Saturday. I think the real rabbit that was ran on Saturday was Federal Case, who was trying to help Intrepid Heart. They were going out for the same owner and trainer. It didn't help Intrepid Heart because he's just turned out to not be quite good enough in this race. I agree that Global Campaign looked great coming into the race. Good pick on out of the gate. I have heard that they are pointing to the Belmont Stakes out of this. I think that's an interesting choice. I've got some concerns about him getting that distance, but he clearly has real ability. This is a horse who showed real acceleration coming off the far turn in this race. He opened up a sizable margin coming to the 8th pole. I do want to give Sir Winston plenty of credit for cutting into the gap late, because typically on the dirt, it's rare to see horses running faster at the end of a race than they are at the beginning of a race. And if you look at the internal splits that Sir Winston ran, he's one of the few horses in a dirt route that I've ever seen who's running faster at the end of this race than he was at the beginning. Just looking at the Trackist figures, his closing 3 furlongs were running 35.26 seconds, which is seemingly a time that you would see on the turf. It's not a time that you see on the dirt that often. I know the track was pretty fast at Belmont on Saturday, so it's difficult to really compare raw times to other days. But Sir Winston was really running at the end of this race. I don't want to make it seem like he was just sucking up for second. He's a horse that really did show an effective closing kick, and he's one that is bred to get longer distances. So I think Sir Winston's an interesting horse moving on to the Belmont Stakes. I know plotters like him aren't always the kinds of horses that you want to bet in the Belmont, but I just think he does have the right turn of foot. and the right pedigree to get that distance. So I think he's an interesting horse to follow moving on to that race. But apparently both of these horses are going. And the 119 TimeformUS speed figure that Global Campaign earned, it stacks up pretty well against the numbers that we saw coming out of the Kentucky Derby, the numbers that we saw in the prep races, and the numbers that all these Preakness horses are running. So it's going to be a competitive final two legs of the Triple Crown, I would think, including these two horses who will be running in those races.
Yeah, just from a speed figure perspective, I thought it was interesting. Intrepid Heart was the heavy favorite in here, despite kind of being way behind Global Campaign in that area, at least. And he actually ran a lifetime best 111. So, just showing sometimes the speed figures get these young horses right. You never really know. I mean, he had won his first two races fairly easily with so-so speed figures. As we've seen with other horses, sometimes they jump up and go faster, but he didn't look like one of them on Saturday.
Yeah, I was one of the suckers who bought into the Intrepid Heart hype coming into this race, even though he didn't look quite good enough on speed figures. A lot of people did knock the Beyer figures that Global Campaign got in his allowance victory and the maiden win earlier this year. But if you look at him compared to the other field in this race on the TimeformUS numbers, he really did stand out. You're right to point that out coming into this race, especially off his prior speed figure in the Fountain of Youth. That was just higher than anybody else had run coming into this. So it's not really surprising that he was able to win this race with a more favorable pace setup. The other dirt race that was run on two other dirt races that were run on Saturday at Belmont Park was the Run Happy, which was won by Firenze Fire. Getting back to one of his better races, he was cutting back to 6 furlongs. He had been pretty dull in a prep race at Tampa Bay Downs earlier this year, but he was back to the good Firenze Fire in this listed stakes race. He just never looked like a loser. Despite the fact that there was other speed in this field, he broke on top. Irad Ortiz took him back slightly off the pace. He was stalking. And once they got into the stretch, you could tell he was just going to win this race by as far as the jockey pleased.
Yeah, I think the board kind of told the story in this one. I mean, he wound up going off 9-5 off what you mentioned was just kind of a dull, listless effort last time out at Tampa. But he looked like the horse that we saw last year. He was actually a horse that I liked in the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile last year. He didn't run very well that day. He finished 4th, well back the City of Light. But he certainly looked like the horse, the real deal here. He had a kind of a slow pace he was sitting off of, but he was right there. So not a huge issue, not like it hurt his chances or anything. And he was beating horses like Recruiting Ready and Killybegs Captain, decent horses, but certainly not graded stakes performers. So Firenze Fire looks like he's back. I expect him to show up in graded stakes and start running well again.
Yeah, I thought Irad Ortiz made a very clever maneuver coming out of the gate because he really took advantage of that alert break by Firenze Fire, and he just pulled on that left rein and completely cut off Skylar Scramjet right at the start, and he basically eliminated one of his major rivals. I don't think it was an illegal move because Skylar Scramjet did break about a length slowly, and when that happens, your horse is automatically going to be put into poor position, but it just totally took Skylar Scramjet out of the race and removed any chance that he had of winning this race. And at that point, you just had to beat Recruiting Ready, who couldn't quite get back to his better efforts. And Firenze Fire just totally dominated. The 119 TimeformUS speed figure doesn't look that spectacular. The final time fig for this race was a 124. And he is moving on to the net mile, which is going to be some race. Coal Front, Matoli, McKinsey, supposedly all running in there. Perhaps even Thunder Snow. So that's going to be some race, and we'll see how Firenze Fire stacks up against those, because he certainly can get the mile, especially the 1-turn mile. He ran that distance in the Dwyer last year, and he won the Champagne as a 2-year-old. So this is a horse that can do it, and just another addition to what should be a fantastic race on Belmont Stakes Day.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Probably is the one race I have marked as one I want to see, even above the Belmont and the Preakness. I'm just really hoping that field comes together as we're hearing it's going to.
Yeah, hopefully no defections before that, but it's shaping up to really be the race of the year for the first half of 2019. The other stakes race on Saturday was the first race on the card, the Vagrancy. It was a small field, just 5 runners, but I thought it was a field with some quality to it. And Heaven Has My Nicky, who was probably one of the outsiders coming into the race. I think most people favored the New York horses in this vagrancy. She got to the lead from the start. I know the TimeformUS pace projector had her in front in a situation favoring the front runner in this race, although I think there was some question about her quality coming into this. But she got to the front, got the jump on them at the quarter pole and Kendra Carmouche, and she was just able to hold on in the late stages. I thought Pacific Gale, though, did run a really nice race to be second. She was maybe a little bit unlucky not to get the win because she did have to pause briefly at the top of the stretch. But credit to Heaven Has My Nikki because she really did step up in class and show that she's a graded stakes level sprinter.
Yeah, she did. This one, this was a little bit tough one as a speed figure guy to do it. I kind of had to spend a little bit of time on this, but I'm comfortable with the 121 that I gave her. Like you said, she had a clear, easy lead, so I'd expect her to run about as good as she could. I think Pacific Gale, who I'm hoping you'll kind of talk about her trip. I remember reading through the chart. I actually didn't see this race live. I missed it with it being the first race on Saturday. But it was quite the novel that the chart guy gave Pacific Gale's trip in there. She was coming out of that really fast race from, and again, the name I'm sure you'll remember, the horse that you love.
Come Dancing.
Yeah, Come Dancing. There we go. Coming out. So I was really interested in that one to see how she'd run out of there. She got a 119. She didn't quite measure up to that 125, but I think the trip had something to do with that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I thought she validated the prior speed figure because I don't think she would have run much faster with a different trip. It wasn't a really tough trip. She had a lot of things go right for her. Pacific Gale. She saved ground around the turn. She was really sitting in the pocket right and behind Heaven Has My Nikki for the entire race. There was just a brief moment at the top of the stretch where it seemed like Joe Bravo, who was Pacific Gale's rider, was almost anticipating Heaven Has My Nikki to not go on. I think he was looking at who was ahead of him and chose to follow separation of powers instead of Heaven Has My Nikki, and it turned out that he made the wrong choice because Separation of Powers was the one that was backing up at the quarter pole, not Heaven Has My Nikki, and he just maybe lost a half length of position as he had to angle back inside and try to come through inside of Separation of Powers before angling out to try to target Heaven Has My Nikki in the last 16th. Just couldn't quite get there. She was finishing really strongly. If she had won, she would have done so with an absolutely perfect trip. I do think that's something you want to note. But the winner was maybe a little bit fortunate to hold on. That said, I thought they both ran really well, and Pacific Gale validated that speed figure that she earned in the prior start behind Come Dancing. And even Dawn the Destroyer, who was fourth in this race, I thought helped to validate that number because she came back and earned a speed figure that was only 3 points lower. So I think that figure for Come Dancing does pretty much hold up. Maybe it's a little bit high, but she certainly had the right setup that day to set that slow pace and go on to such a huge figure. So it's not unusual to see a horse run a top number in that situation. I thought these are good grade 3 level sprinters. And if they move on to tougher races in the future, they have a shot.
Yeah, I agree. And good points about the trip. That's really why I asked about it. I was really surprised when I read the chart. It's just how long it is. If people haven't taken a time to look at it, just go read it. And then when I watched the race, I was like, I don't know. That looks like a pretty good trip to me. Like you said, she had to wait just a little bit, but I'm not sure it merited the novel that we got from Equibase. But hey, I'm all for detail. The more detail they want to give us, the better when you look back at the race.
Yeah, it's the kind of thing you're probably only going to overanalyze if you bet on Pacific Gale, as I did. So I was very attuned to her slight trouble in that race. There were 2 other stakes races this week at Belmont Park that didn't take place on Saturday. One was from Thursday's card. It was the flat out going the unusual distance of 1 3/8 miles, which is not quite one full circuit of the Belmont Park Oval. They actually start down the stretch, almost at the clubhouse turn, still on the straightaway though. And Marconi was able to win this race, stepping up off a victory at Gulfstream Park last time. Not the fastest race that he ran in his prior start, but he was a dominant winner of this one. Looked like he got the distance better than some other horses, and that probably made the difference.
Yeah, it did. As the figure guy, I just wanted to talk a little bit about this. A race we originally had in the chart. I had it as having a fast pace, and you wrote to me, and you were completely right. Just watching the race, there's no way it's a fast pace. And I look back on it, and we really just don't have much of a baseline for this distance. Basically, the flat out is the only race ever run at this distance. So all I'm doing is comparing it to other flat outs. So I made the decision just to go ahead and remove the pace figures from here. I don't want to paint a false picture for people. So that 119 that Marconi got is strictly based on the final time of the race. Rocketry seems to be rounding back into form. He ran a 116. It's kind of funny to say, but it's probably a little short for him still. I imagine maybe we'll see him in the Brooklyn on Belmont Day, but good effort from those two. As far as these longer races go, I'm not sure how much faith you want to put into these numbers as horses cut back or go longer, but solid effort.
Yeah, the only temptation to say that maybe the pace was pretty honest, bordering on fast, is how far back Rocketry was in the early going. But I think you have to understand about Rocketry that he is a horse that just has absolutely no early speed. I'm sure he's a plotter in TimeformUS PPs with an early pace rating that's probably somewhere in the 20s or 30s, because he just drops so far out of his races in the early going, and he just has to gradually work his way back into contention. And he did that in this flat out. He just didn't really have the time to wind up his run. By the time they got to the top of the stretch, he still had a lot of ground to make up, and Marconi had the energy left to finish the race and hold him off. I did think Rocketry ran on well to be second in this race, because it briefly looked like he was going to finish off the board, and he was able to get up and pass Tour de Force for second by a nose. I think Rocketry's connections have an interesting decision to make now, because they could go on and run in the Brooklyn. A mile and a half is probably long enough for him. I think even a race like that might be slightly on the short side. He also could run in the Belmont Gold Cup going 2 miles. He actually ran in that race last year and only lost by 2 lengths to that European horse, Call to Mind. So Rocketry can run on the turf as well. I'm interested to see what they choose for him, because there's an argument to be made that the Belmont Gold Cup might actually be the more appropriate choice.
Yeah, I actually forgot about that race, kind of a new race. And yeah, that distance is definitely better for him, in my opinion.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see where they go, because the Brooklyn, over the years, I think as they run more of these marathon races in New York, races like the Flat Out, they've got, I think, the Birdstone at Saratoga. There's also a race in the fall with the Temperance Hill, I think it is, that Rocketry run last year. As you run more of these races, I think it's really strengthened the field that we see in the Brooklyn, which has become a fun race on the Belmont undercard every year. And I think it's going to be a strong field for that race again this year. The last race that we'll talk about from Belmont Park was run on Sunday. Unfortunately, Sunday's card was just totally washed out by rain, all off the turf races. And this race was scheduled for the dirt, but it was run over a sloppy track. And I think it really affected this Gold Fever, which was upset by Wendell Fong, Jeremiah Engelhardt horse, who was coming, I think, out of some races from Laurel. The big favorite in this race was Much Better, who was finishing second in the Bayshore in his prior start to Mind Control. He was a deserving favorite based on his superior speed figures and class lines. It just seemed that right from the start, you could tell Much Better was not handling the sloppy track, and he was never really a factor in this race.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised when I watched the race to see Call Paul just take it right to him at the beginning. But like you said, I agree, Much Better didn't handle the slop at all. I think you can draw a line through that race for him. He was struggling, even though he was up on the lead. Paul was looking a lot better than he was. They were going pretty quick. I think that's probably what affected Call Paul later, but I don't want to knock Wendell Fong too much, because it's not like he came from way back. He was just a couple lengths behind Call Paul. He ground him down a little bit and won pretty easily in the end. So it was a big effort for Jeremiah Engelhardt. He's one of my favorite trainers as a bettor. He tends to get overlooked in these races. That's getting less and less so as time goes on. People are catching on, but you can still get a price with him.
Yeah, certainly got a price on this horse, and he really did step forward, Wendell Fong, off his prior speed figures. This figure that he got for this race was significantly faster than anything he had earned before, but we tend to see that sometimes with 3-year-olds who just happen to be improving in their 3rd or 4th career start. And also, he obviously loved the track conditions, whereas others did not, and that also makes a big difference. I wonder what they're going to do with Much Better out of this race, because he seemed like one of the top players coming into the Woody Stevens on Belmont Stakes Day, and this is the local prep for that race. I wonder if they still go there, if Bob Baffert takes him back to California, because I believe they had left him in New York between the Bayshore and this race. I don't think that had much to do with his performance. He just seemed to not handle the track. And you could tell that, as you were saying, right from the start when Call Paul outran him to the lead. You knew that Much Better was not going to win at that point, because he's not the type that you want to see passing horses late. But I wonder if they go on to the Woody Stevens, because he certainly would have been one of the major players in that race. This effort certainly it dampens some of the enthusiasm for him coming into that spot, though.
Right. It just depends how much credence you put in the track affecting his performance. I do want to note Call Paul, actually, he ran a 120 in here. So despite having a lot of wins, he got much the best TimeformUS speed figure that he's ever ran in a losing effort here. A little bit change in running style. I think it'd probably help him to revert back to maybe sitting a little bit off the pace and making a bit of a run late. I imagine we'll see him in the Woody Stevens. No reason not to send him there. And I don't think he'd be a horse that we'd see up front in that race.
Yeah, Call Paul's performance reminded me a lot of what we saw at Firenze Fire in the Run Happy on Saturday, where he just broke on top of the field, just like Firenze Fire did. He was really fired up coming out of the gate, showed a lot more speed than he had in his prior starts, and it really translated to one of his top performances. So Call Paul up this effort, I think he, too, is another player in the Woody Stevens, and I imagine that's where they're going to go next with him. So that's shaping up to be another interesting race. That's all the stakes action from Belmont Park, but we'll discuss a few more races from some other circuits. We'll talk about one race from Santa Anita last weekend. That was the Santa Barbara, going 1.5 miles, 3 turns around the course. That was run by Cause for Commotion. It was only a 5-horse field, not the toughest group, but I do want to highlight this race because the winner was supremely dominant in victory. She really looked good.
Yeah, she did. I mean, you don't see often. I think she won by 9 lengths, if I'm remembering that right off the top of my head. You don't see that very often on turf. Definitely a weak race for a grade 3. I mean, she was coming out of a losing effort in an allowance race and still went off 6-5. It was a shorter race, but way too short for her, and she was a bit pace compromised. She clearly likes these longer distances, 1.25 miles, 1.5 miles. 119 is a good figure. It puts her, she'll be a player in the California Turf Division, particularly against at these longer distances. Not a whole lot to say about this one. It was an easy figure to make, just kind of a workout for her. There was really no competition. She did what she had to do, and let's see how she does next time.
Yeah, she's an interesting horse if you look at her past performances, because on paper, she didn't look that exceptional compared to the rest of this field. But I think she's a filly that really moves forward at these marathon distances. She's a daughter of a American who's by Dynaformer. She just has a ton of stamina pedigree. And if you really single out or just hone in on her races at 1 3/8 miles, 1.5 miles, even 1.25 miles, they're far and away her best efforts. And she was just prepared to go this distance, whereas others were not. And, I want to give her credit for running well. I also want to acknowledge, as you were saying, nobody ran behind her in this race. And just to highlight that, I mean, the number 1 Animosity, who was the early leader, was completely steadied out in the far turn. I mean, she dropped back to last like she was going to be eased. And then somehow she came on again to nearly get third in this race because there was just everybody was stopping in the last 1/8 of a mile. So the victory was impressive, but the margin of victory was largely a product of the fact that nobody was doing any running behind her. So I don't think she's a horse that's going to come east and win any top races, but she will be competitive in other races going 1.5 miles or longer distances because that is what she wants to do. We'll talk about 2 races from Arlington Park, which I don't think we've mentioned any races from Arlington yet on this podcast. The big race there on Saturday was the Hanshin Cup, a grade 3 race going 1 mile over the synthetic main track. And it was won by Lanier, who is a horse that was second behind another rival in this race, nonetheless, in the Kentucky Cup Classic at Turfway, a race that we talked about a number of weeks ago. Lanier's a nice horse. He got a decent speed figure in this race. I think he did benefit from the pace a little bit, but just a good grade 3 performance for a horse that likes synthetic tracks.
Yeah, it's interesting. He's a horse that had lost to Nonetheless, as you mentioned last time, but yeah, we still had him as our top power pick. Some of that had to do with the speed figures. Despite losing the Nonetheless, when you use the weight adjustment that we do, he had a 4-point advantage over Nonetheless. I believe he was dropping 3 pounds, whereas Nonetheless was adding 6. Nonetheless didn't run particularly well, but it's hard to put a whole lot of stock in these synthetic track races anymore unless they're going to keep running on synthetic. Presque Isle just opened. Turfway will open back up later in fall. Arlington, of course, is one of those. But, these are just kind of specialists now, and you got to kind of follow them as how they do on these races. Very few of them ever back it up when they turn the dirt and run. But, you kind of got to just watch them when they show up in these graded stakes on synthetic.
Yeah, I try to look at these horses' past performance just to try to get some sort of gauge on where they could go from here, or if they can transition the synthetic form to other surfaces. And Lanier, to his credit, has won on all the surfaces. He's won on fast dirt, wet dirt, synthetic. He's won on turf, I think multiple times on turf. He does seem like more of one of those synthetic turf horses, but he is best on synthetic horses. And he's just looking at his prior turf races. He's not really a graded stakes level horse on that surface. So he's taking advantage of the right spots, running in these stakes races, these lower level graded races on synthetic courses, and he's getting his time in the spotlight. His connections are placing him very well. I just don't know how this translates into the bigger picture in terms of races nationally. Probably doesn't matter that much. One horse, though, who did run an exceptional speed figure over the synthetic track at Arlington was well-abled on Friday in an allowance race. This is a horse for Larry Ravelli, who was coming off a very long layoff. I think it had been almost 15 months since he had run his prior race. This is only 5 furlongs, but he earned the highest TimeformUS speed figure tied for the highest TimeformUS speed figure of the week in a pretty visually impressive effort.
Yeah, he's always been a really fast horse. I believe he ran in one of the Breeders' Cup juvenile races and led for a little while, if I remember right. He's always up front. I think the one time he got outrun for the lead at Woodbine as a 2-year-old, he just ran a crazy, ridiculous. Actually, I think it might have been it was as a 2-year-old, a 170-something pace figure it took to get him off the lead, which is just insane for a sprint race. But, really quick horse. He had run some big numbers last year at Turfway. He matched that 128. They actually shipped him out west to Golden Gate looking for a spot for a synthetic race, which you kind of have to do nowadays. And I think something went wrong that day because he only ran a 116 that day when running second. And that's when he disappeared for, like you said, a long time, about 15 months. But certainly impressive, came back as good as ever, and really fast horse. He has shown some ability on dirt and on turf. So, maybe sprints, it's not quite as big a deal for these horses to change surfaces. And he'd be one I'd be willing to give a shot on turf or on dirt, depending on the field he draws in against.
Yeah, I agree about the surface thing. He really hasn't run on turf since he was a young horse. And that race you were mentioning in the Breeders' Cup, that was the Breeders' Cup juvenile turf, which was run around 2 turns. And he's just never going to be the kind of horse that can get 2 turns, although he did set a very fast pace in that race. I think he probably deserves another shot on the turf. He was second in a stakes race at Saratoga going a sprint distance as a 2-year-old, I believe. That must have been 3 years ago at this point. But he's a really fast horse. How much stock do you put in these speed figures going 5 furlongs? Do those really translate to longer sprint distances like 6 furlongs, 6.5, or is it just kind of an anomaly?
It just depends on the horse. In this case, I probably wouldn't expect him to match that at 6 furlongs, though he did it at 6.5 at Turfway as a 3-year-old, and he ran really quick. He actually beat Lanier that day, which is by 7 lengths, which is kind of interesting. It just depends on the horse. He's shown he can do it, that he can run longer and run quick. So maybe I wouldn't knock him as much. Sometimes you get these specialists, especially in the turf where you get 5 furlongs to 5.5 can be a jump, let alone 6. So it's just a horse by horse basis. And I think this one has shown he can do it, and he looks so good. I'd be willing to give him a shot. I'm really going to add him to my stable mail and see where he shows up next.
Yeah, I want to see if he can stay sound now, because watching him, he's one of these horses that is not the prettiest mover. It's kind of not surprising that he'd be the kind of horse that disappears for a long time or has some physical issues, because he almost has that Vekoma thing going on where his legs just go in all different directions. He hits the ground really hard. It just seems like a horse that's kind of hard on himself, but clearly is really fast.
Yeah, he's one of those horses that no matter what race he's in, he spells big trouble for the other speeds, and you can almost be assured of a fast pace. So he's either going to win or he's going to set it up for somebody else. Other speeds are in big trouble.
Yeah, for sure. Speaking of fast speed figures, we'll go to another track that I don't think we've talked about yet, Delaware Park. On their Wednesday card, the first race of the day, actually, was a maiden race, small field, nothing really exceptional about it, except for the fact that there was a first-time starter that ran a 113 TimeformUS speed figure in his debut. This was a 3-year-old colt going out for the Claudio Gonzalez barn. I watched this race, not sure what to expect. This horse looked really good doing it.
Yeah, I went and watched this race this morning because I didn't watch it on Wednesday. I didn't even notice the speed figure, so I'm glad that you picked it out. It's one of those ones where I just did my worksheet, all the races lined up, so I plugged in the numbers and sent them in. But yeah, I went and watched it. It wasn't much of a field. The horse who was 4-5 in here, King Nikia, he had lost 3 or 4 times. Hadn't run particularly fast in the 90s, solid enough. So it's not like Smart Time was a sure thing and everybody knew about him. I mean, he went off second choice to a horse who didn't look all that great on paper, but he looked good, and he was a horse who could run for a while too, to me.
Yeah, and one of the indicators that says to us that this is probably a speed figure that's legitimate is just the massive gaps between the second and third place finishers. He beat the second place finisher, King Nakia, who you were saying is a horse with prior speed figures that sort of put him in line with the figure here in this race. He beat that horse by almost 12 lengths. Then there was another 12 lengths between him, the second place finisher, and the third place finisher. So Smart Time was finishing 23 3/4 lengths ahead of the third place finisher. That says to you that this is a race that was exceptionally fast by the winner. And Don Alberto, who owns this horse, I haven't seen them have any horses with Claudio Gonzalez. They have horses with Tom Abertrani and some other trainers, I'm forgetting now, but they do well with their first-time starters across the board. Even Tom Abertrani, who's not really known as for winning with firsters, he does get some first-time starting winners for this owner. I think Bob Baffert has horses with them too. And this horse was really ready to go first time out. He's by Bernardini. The dam Samara has produced the turf sprinter Samara for Jason Service, who we've seen in some stakes races going, I think, 5 furlongs on the turf Gulfstream Park this past winter. So this horse is definitely bred to be fast and seems like one that's pretty fast and might have a future in some sprint races.
Yeah, what impressed me with him is how he just went by the leader as they were headed to the turn. I mean, King Niki, while he's no great shakes, but he's a quick horse, and he went by him like he was standing still, and he did it just under the mildest of urging. I mean, the jockey he asked got instant response and just opened up on him in the blink of an eye. That turn of foot really impressed me, and I think this is one to watch going on.
Yeah, I'm going to put him in my stable mail to see where he goes next. So we'll stick with the 3-year-olds and go to some higher class runners to talk about some of the contenders in the Preakness. I know this is a race that's not drawn yet. Unfortunately, it's not being drawn until Wednesday, which is be tomorrow in the evening. But we know, I think, basically who the prospective field is going to be. I think there are 12 runners that are considered likely entrants at this point. Improbable and War of Will are the two big names coming out of the Kentucky Derby. What did you make of their 2 trips, and what do you think their prospects are going to be moving on to this mile and 3/16 Preakness?
Improbable is an interesting case, and he's probably going to be the favorite, and he hasn't won a race this year while he's ran well. I thought his trip in the Derby was fine. I mean, for a Derby, I mean, it's never going to be a completely clear, trouble-free trip. But, I thought he had every chance, and he just flattened out a little bit and ran basically what he's been running. Of all the horses in the top 5 or 6 of the Derby, I think he had the least trouble by far. So, he's one I'm probably going to be looking to beat. War of Will's a bit tougher case. I just don't think we really know how he was going to finish. I don't want to get into the DQ thing again, but he was definitely affected. I do think it cost him a placing. I think he would have been closer up, but, to say how much closer up. So I'm not sure what to make of him. Out of those 2, I would probably prefer War of Will in here. I think, he was coming off of that non-effort when he hurt himself at the fairgrounds. So he probably has a little more room to move forward. So out of those 2, I would say War of Will.
Yeah, I'm really not sure what to make of Improbable. It does sort of feel like the narrative going into this Preakness is sort of everyone settling on him as the clear horse to beat. And I guess I understand that because he's a Bob Baffert trainee. Mike Smith is getting on board for this race. I know there's some magic there. So it's like the whole team getting back together to recreate the Justify magic. I get all of that. Just based on the Derby performance, I agree. Pretty good trip that day. He didn't really finish off the race as well as I was hoping. I do think there might be some validity to the idea that he didn't love the sloppy track because he didn't seem totally comfortable over it in the Arkansas Derby either. So if there's a fast track on Saturday at Pimlico, maybe that's going to really make the difference for him. Whereas War of Will just seemed to love the sloppy going. He had handled it in his prior effort over it in a maiden race at Churchill Downs last fall. So you knew that War of Will was one of the few horses in the Derby that really wasn't going to be negatively affected by the sloppy track. So I do want to take that into account. But as you were saying, if Improbable is a short price in this race or the clear favorite, I'm not sure that I feel like he has to win. Just based on speed figures, there are other horses, including some new shooters, who are just as fast and I think really deserve to be talked about.
One of those, there are.
Yeah,
Owendale and another Twist of Fate coming out of the Lexington. Both have 120s coming in. I think we talked about Warriors Charge on our Pacecast. He was winning won an allowance race on the Friday of the Arkansas Derby. And actually, I kind of threw together, as you saw, just the last race of all of the horses currently pointed to the Preakness. And interestingly enough, he's the only one that was either first or second at the first call last time out. So I'll be curious. We'll get the pace projector up after the draw, but I'm kind of curious what it's going to look like because, well, I think there's, a lot of tactical speed in here. I'm not sure there's any true front runners outside of Warriors Charge. So could prove to be an interesting pace projector and something we'll get to talk about. I know I certainly will. I'll write an article on it like I always do, and looking forward to analyzing that.
Yeah, I'm curious about that as well regarding the pace, because up until a few days ago, it looked like there wasn't a whole lot of pace in this race. And then within the past couple of days, we saw that Warriors Charge is entering this race. I think Market King was added to the conversation as well. He's another horse who could potentially be a speed. So in the past couple of days, it does seem like the pace has gotten a little bit faster. But I agree with you. There were no real clear front runners. I guess Warriors Charge might be that kind of horse. Always Mining is another horse that I think we should briefly touch upon. I know he's a horse that a lot of people are looking forward to making this jump into a graded stakes company off a series of local Maryland performances. He's really just dominated the 3-year-old scene at Laurel. He's looked great in his races. He's versatile enough where he doesn't need the lead. He might be the kind of maximum security situation where he sets some slower paces in his win. So I'm interested to see how the pace projector handles a horse like this, because he is more of a front running type generally, but he's not a real speed crazy kind of horse who needs the lead or is probably going to have a high early pace rating. I don't know that for sure. I'm just kind of guessing about that. But he's a horse that I think is kind of polarizing coming into this race because he's been so visually impressive. He just hasn't really beaten real competition in his prior starts.
Yeah, I think the thing with him, I have no problem with people who would want to bet him and think, he's got more in the tank and maybe could run faster. But I think any value you got with him kind of went out the window with the defections from the Derby. I think way too many people are probably going to gravitate towards him being the local horse. And, he hasn't run fast enough, in my opinion. Maximum Security, I had questions about the pace, but he still ran pretty fast in the Florida Derby from a final time perspective. I haven't really got that from Always Mining, but yeah, I'll probably, maybe I'll get burnt again, but he's a horse I'm going to be against, just looking for better value, because I think with the defections, there's not a whole lot of competition, and people are going to be looking a lot heavier at the newer shooters in here.
Yeah, and I don't want to be too hard on this horse. I probably misspoke a little bit by saying that he's beaten nobody, because he did beat Win going 7 furlongs. He beat Joe Villa 2-back going the mile on the 16th, and he came back to win the Long Branch last week. He even beat Wendell Fong in a start 3-back in that Miracle Wood, and he obviously ran much better to win the no pun intended. He ran much better to win the sprint race, the Gold's Fever at Belmont Park on Sunday. So Always Mining has beaten legitimate horses. He just hasn't beaten the top, or hasn't faced the top grade 1 level 3-year-olds, whereas all of the horses that participated in the traditional Derby preps have. So I'm with you. I'm a little bit skeptical of him, though I agree with all of the defections. He is a player in this race. I'm not going to totally dismiss him. I just wonder about the value. One other horse I want to get your take on, a new shooter, is Bourbon War, because he's kind of a funny horse. He got that great pace set up in the Fountain of Youth 2-back. Then he got the opposite situation in the Florida Derby last time, where there was just no pace for him, and it really compromised a horse that is a deep closer like he is. What do you do with him in a race like this, a horse that's faced two completely disparate pace situations, and we're not really sure what kind of pace he's going to get in this Preakness, but obviously he's talented when he gets the right setup, but I just don't know if I trust him to get that setup and capitalize on it in a race of this magnitude.
Yeah, he'll be interesting. He's one of the horses, obviously, if the pace projector says it's going to be a fast pace. I don't know it for sure, but I can almost guess he's going to have our best late pace rating. So he would definitely be a factor in my underneath bets. I'm not sure he's really quick enough to get into contention early enough, but he certainly provides that big contrast, like you mentioned, where the just crazy pace in the Fountain of Youth, crazy fast pace, which if our listeners get a chance, that's a good chart to go look back at and kind of see how the horses have done coming out of there. And then the Florida Derby was the complete opposite, where he basically had no chance whatsoever. But I think he still ran pretty well that day. His speed figure's not going to reflect it because he just never really had the chance. But, if he runs back to that 115, he ran in the Fountain of Youth, it would make him a fringe contender. And that at this point has happened a couple months ago. But maybe he's even got a little more in the tank than that. And that's how I would consider him a fringe contender that really needs a fast pace to do his best run.
Yeah, he's one of those horses that I haven't really decided what I want to do with him yet. He's a horse that I've gone back and forth between liking and feeling like I should be against in his prior races. And I have to really see how the field shapes up. And it's a fun race because I know a lot of people are kind of getting down on this Preakness, saying that, the official Derby winner is not running. The horse that got DQ'd out of the Derby win is not running. So it's just kind of not a real Triple Crown race. But I kind of don't mind because it's a really interesting handicapping race. It's a very competitive field. I'm interested to see how it gets bet because I think a lot of these horses should be very closely grouped in terms of the odds towards especially among the favorites, because there are a lot of horses that are quick enough to win this race in terms of speed figures. So I kind of am just looking forward to going into handicapping this race with a clear head like any other race. And I really don't know who I'm going to pick yet. It's just going to be a fun handicapping puzzle, even if it doesn't have maybe the top star 3-year-olds that you would be looking forward to see in a traditional Preakness.
Right. I'm kind of curious on your take on Owendale. We've barely touched on him, and he actually comes in with a best last race speed figure with a 120, but it was a big jump up for him. So, yeah, I'm just curious if you're considering him at all.
I definitely am. He's the horse that really confused me when I was handicapping the Lexington, because his race 3 back at the fairgrounds on January 17th was a race that I'm interested to see what you want to say when you go back and look at that speed figure, because the Beyer guys gave that race a gigantic number. They gave it a 91. I think we gave it something like a 97. So obviously we did something different. Either it was broken out or Beyer broke it out or some different method to make the speed figure. And it was difficult to do because looking at it at the time, all of the horses are running new Beyer tops by 10 to 15 points. It just seemed like a number that you wanted to be really skeptical of if you were using the Beyer. And Owendale's race in the Risen Star kind of backed up that notion. But then he comes back in the Lexington and runs a much faster race. And another horse coming out of there, I believe Frolickmore, also came back to eventually validate that January 17th Beyer number. So it's hard to get a gauge on these 3-year-olds at this time of year because they're just improving quickly and they can do it very suddenly from race to race. So it's hard to know how to really handle these speed figures when they seemingly run a lot faster than you would expect them to. Just based solely on Owendale's Lexington, I think he's a player in this race. He got the jump on some horses like Another Twisted Fate who were sort of stuck inside at the wrong point in time. I do think if Another Twisted Fate had been outside in Lexington, there might have been a different result because he really did lose momentum coming to the top of the stretch. And it was the short stretch, which sort of gave Owendale the advantage that he got the jump on those horses. But he ran a fast race, and he was wide that day, so he did lose significant ground at a critical juncture of the race. I think he's a player in this race, and he's one that I'm definitely considering. But again, I'm trying to leave an open mind because I want to see how the field is drawn, how the pace shakes out, post positions, how it all kind of comes together before I make my final selection.
Yeah, I'm with you there. And let's see what the draw looks like. I'm sure we're both going to talk about this race plenty in the coming week. I know we'll probably both talk about it on Out of the Gate this week. I'm doing a piece with Jason Beam, the current announcer at Monmouth, which I'll tweet out. And it's a fascinating race. I'm not really down on it because of the Derby winner and the Derby faux winner kind of I'll let people decide which one's which there. But, I think it's a great race as a bettor and a handicapper, and I'm really looking forward to it. So we'll be definitely talking more about that. Interesting you mentioned about his speed figure at the fairgrounds. We do have it marked as one of our question mark codes with a C for conditions. I actually don't do the fairgrounds. My assistant does. So I'm going to look that up, and I'll tweet out about it. I haven't mentioned my Twitter, I don't think, on here. It's TimeformUS Figs, if anybody wants to follow. I'll also tweet out today that thing of the Preakness Contenders that just shows their last race and what they've been running. So when you listen, you kind of have a frame of reference for this.
Yeah, that's a great point. I am at Horse to Watch, by the way. Good to mention our Twitter account, so you can interact with us if you have any feedback about our opinions that we put forth. And yeah, I agree with you. Owendale's a really interesting horse coming into this race, and he's just another one that I think really fits well. And I'll be writing my usual analysis of this race. We're not doing a package for this race like we did for the Derby. I'll be putting out free analysis, my usual horse-by-horse analysis of the Preakness Stakes, and I think I'll also be writing analysis of the Dixie Stakes on the Preakness undercard. And as Craig mentioned, he'll be doing a pace piece as well as other stuff. So look forward to all of that as we talk more about the Preakness in writing in the upcoming days. I think my analysis will be out probably on Thursday. I'll try to get it done in time for that after the draw on Wednesday. So more on that later in the week, and we'll be back, of course, next week to wrap up the Preakness and discuss our thoughts, our post-race thoughts after it's been run. Craig, thanks again. Good thoughts as always. I'm David Aragona, Craig Milkowski. This was the TimeformUS Pacecast, and you can always find us on drf.com, Spotify, iTunes, YouTube, SoundCloud, wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for the Daily Racing Form and subscribe, and search for the TimeformUS Pacecast. Thanks for listening, guys, and we'll see you again next week.